Before we get started, I would appreciate if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you.
Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So today in this video I'm going to be talking about CBDCs and China. So I'm going to use China as like a case study example because China is literally ahead of the world when it comes to all of this. So I've realized, like, why am I focusing this whole time on Europe and what's going to happen or not going to happen in November in Europe when ISO 20022 goes live in the Eurozone for their RTGS HVAPS system, when we could just look at China and see what happened when they went live, should I say, with their ISO 20022 migration for their RTGS systems. What happened in China? What are they doing today? So let's look at China, because we already have countries in Asia, specifically China, that is like 5 to 10 steps ahead of Europe. I think Europe is trying to get to where China is today, and China is 10 steps ahead. So if we want to kind of have an example of what happens, let's just look at China, or we want to know what happens next with Europe, let's just look at China. So we should just take a look at China and see what they have done so far, because Europe is still playing catch up, guys. They're trying to reach where China is today, and China is just leagues ahead of Europe. So I'm going to do a two-part video series looking at China in relation to ISO 20022, CBDCs, because I think China is a perfect example since they have already done it all, basically. So when did China adopt ISO 20022? China basically adopted ISO 20022 for their RTGS system, CIPS, and CNAPS in 2015. So basically China has been ISO 20022 compliant for 7 years now. Bear in mind that most countries in Europe, in the Western world, have yet to become compliant with the standard, and are doing so 7 to 8 years later after China. So if you want to know what happens next after Europe becomes ISO 20022 compliant, let's just look at China for the past 7 years and what happened next with them. So the question is, did China stop using correspondent banking after the adoption of ISO 20022 to use XRP? And the answer to that is no, they didn't. In fact, according to SWIFT, what happened was, after China became ISO 20022 compliant, it just further improved the connectivity of their payment system and their transactions with other banks cross-border via the correspondent banking network. Now, SWIFT tells you this. So in 2015, when they migrated over to ISO 20022 in the messaging layer for their RTGS system, they did not have to use XRP for instant settlement. And that's the argument everyone's saying is going to happen in Europe. People keep saying that ISO 20022 goes live in the Eurozone. HVPS RTGS goes live in the Eurozone. No, HVPS RTGS is already live in the Eurozone, and the only thing that's going live in the Eurozone is ISO 20022. That's all. Nothing to do with having to use XRP or changing the RTGS system to DLT technology. It doesn't mean any of that at all. And we can see from China, when they became ISO 20022 compliant, they still used correspondent banking, and it just enhanced their cross-border transactions via the correspondent banking network, as I've already shown you guys how it all works in multiple diagrams. So when China became ISO 20022 compliant, they did not use XRP for instant settlement. They still used their correspondent banking network, with which alongside ISO 20022 messaging standard enhanced their connectivity and their cross-border transfers with other financial institutions. And this was all done via the correspondent banking network. So here you can see a document, and this document is from SWIFT, and it basically just tells you that the CIPS accelerates the internationalization of the RMB. RMB is the yuan, and the CIPS is their RTGS system. And this document was published in 2016. And if you just read this part here, it says the cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, launched by the Chinese Central Bank on 8th of October 2015, has made it much easier for correspondent banks to execute payment instructions on behalf of clients participating in cross-border transactions denominated in renminbi, basically their yuan. So as you can clearly see here, it says correspondent banks and it says payment instructions, because I've been hammering this point over and over again that ISO 20022 is about the messaging layer. It's not about the settlement layer. And the settlement layer is still going to be using correspondent banking. And even until now, I don't think people grasp it, because no matter how much times I say it and no matter how much evidence I can produce, people still want to not accept the fact that ISO 20022 is about the payment instructions, and they're still going to be using correspondent banking afterwards, just as they've told us and just as China did 7 years ago. Don't you think, yeah, let's just use our critical thinking. Since China is so ahead, if changing to ISO 20022 meant that their RTGS system is now able to use XRP and DLT, and it's about the changing of the settlement layer, don't you think they would have done it 7, 8 years ago? And would have had their CBDCs back then running and doing it? But it has nothing to do with that. It was just the messaging layer, improving the messaging layer. And yes, improving the messaging layer enhances cross-border payments via correspondent banking, and it also enables, because the ISO 20022 standard is flexible, it also enables interoperability with DLT-based RTGS systems and other payment innovative methods. Of course, it does that, yes. But by default, it does not mean that when you migrate over to ISO 20022, you are now using XRP. So the fact that CIPS has also adopted the ISO 20022 international payment messaging, I like how they keep reminding us that it's a messaging standard, is now facilitating the widening of the cross-border connectivity of CIPS, not only with other payment market infrastructures, but with correspondent banks around the world. Okay, so I'm clearly showed you here in 2016, after China migrated to ISO 20022, in 2015, it basically enhanced their connectivity and their cross-border payments with their RTGS system to other financial institutions via correspondent banks. That's why I said let's look at China, because that's exactly what's going to happen in Europe. When November comes and they become ISO 20022 and all you people are staying up at night counting down the clock, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, hooray, XRP is going to be used. And then you look at the price and it's not hundreds and hundreds of pounds the next day and nothing happens. And then your bubble pops and then you're going to have to figure out, oh, why has not anything happened? Ah, I remember that channel, the audacious investor that we've been taking the mick out of all these weeks and all these months beforehand, saying he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's making up his own documents and evidence. Let me go back and revisit those videos and this time take it more seriously and see what he actually presented to understand what is actually going on. It's alright, guys. It's not my fault that you can't see it now. So what is the difference basically between China and Europe? China went live in 2015 with the ISO 20022 messaging standard for their CIPS, RTGS, HVPS system. And straight after that, they still used correspondent banking for cross-border transactions with enhanced benefits nonetheless. Now, 7 years later, Europe is going live in the Eurozone in November with the ISO 20022 messaging standard for their T2 RTGS HVPS system. And all of a sudden, it means by the XRP community that XRP is going to be used to transfer value because RTGS equals HVPS, which automatically must mean XRP apparently. So if that's the case, China should have been using XRP for 7 years now for their RTGS system. Isn't that so? Because they've been ISO 20022 compliant since 2015. So they should be using XRP because that's what you say Europe's going to do when they change in November. So if not, what is the difference between China and Europe going live with ISO 20022? You tell me. Can anyone explain what's the difference? If in November Europe's going to use XRP because they're changing their messaging layer, upgrading it, so why hasn't China done it for the past 7 years? Can someone give me a logical explanation as to what's the difference between the two countries going live to ISO 20022 with their RTGS system? Anyone? So here's the China's digital yuan CBDC journey. This is the CBDC journey of China and their digital yuan. So since 2014, China has been exploring the use of a CBDC. The first test of their CBDC in a few cities was in 2020, so 7 years later. So they started exploration in 2014, and 7 years later, they did their first pilot test of their CBDC, the digital yuan, in a few cities. In 2021, the test was expanded into more cities, throughout the country of China. In 2022, further expansions of the testing regions are planned for other major Chinese cities, and so far it's been 2 years testing and still ongoing. So they launched in 2020, they're still testing it for the past 2 years, and these tests are still ongoing. So in 2022, China promoted their trial launch of their CBDC at the Asian Games and the Winter Olympics. The final launch of their CBDC, where it's out of the testing pilot phase into a final launched product, is not yet known, because even though they have their CBDC out there in the market, it's still under a pilot program, a testing program. So the final launch is actually not yet known. Now in 2022, China tests their CBDCs in cross-border transaction trials between partners, including Hong Kong, Thailand, and UAE, using a bridge. So this is the timeline of China's CBDC journey, starting from exploring it in 2014 to having a prototype 7 years later in 2020 to doing testing for the past 2 years, and also in 2022 they did cross-border transaction trials between partners, and they used a bridge using their CBDC. So how is China's CBDC being received so far? So China's CBDC on the retail side has had trouble being used and breaking into the market over already established private digital payment services such as Alipay and WeChat, because Alipay and WeChat are digital payment services in China that has been there for years, and they basically conquered the market. They're established, developed applications for digital payments by the private sector, and they've just conquered the market in China. So China's CBDC really has to compete with Alipay and WeChat. So encouraging people to use it, the Chinese CBDC, the digital yuan, in retail has been a bit of a challenge for China, and people are not really interested in using it when there are already more established, convenient, and developed alternatives on the market. So the government has tried to incentivize people during the trials to use the digital yuan by giving away millions during the digital yuan trials, and it is believed by some that the digital yuan will not be able to overtake the private sector alternatives at all without substantial government interference to the point of mandatory use. So some people believe that the only way the digital yuan is only going to conquer the market is that the government is going to interfere and make it mandatory to use the digital yuan in order to overtake the private sector. And that's something that I wouldn't put past China at all. So check out this video talking about the Chinese CBDC digital yuan that was trialed at the Olympic Games.
Please take away ECN1 hardware wallet. Now I have a card with the equivalent amount of $20 in ECNY with me on this card. You can go to almost every point of sales inside the Olympics bubble. We have the dining halls and then the merchandise stores. You can use the ECNY physical card to pay for all of these things. I just ordered a Americano, okay, and I'm tapping the card. And we're done.
The ECNY is basically the digital yuan, the CBDC.
So far, the digital yuan has failed to resonate. The near-term goal for the ECNY is to popularize it within China, but so far this has met some challenges. First is that the ECNY is facing competition from other entrenched mobile payment platforms, but China is way ahead in the development of the digital currency compared to other countries, including the US, which is considering its own digital dollar.
Okay, so that's that video talking about the Chinese ECNY, CBDCs, and its reception amongst the people in China. So here is a timeline for the China CBDC. To just give you a quick timeline, in 2014, China explores CBDCs. In 2015, the CIPS, which is the Chinese Central Bank's RTGS system, HVPS system, becomes ISO 20022 compliant. In 2015 and ongoing, China still uses correspondent banking, despite being ISO 20022 compliant for the past 7 years. Now, in 2020, China launches the CBDC as a pilot. 2020 ongoing. China's CBDC is in trial launch, being gradually extended out to different cities. In 2022, China starts testing their CBDC in cross-border transactions using a bridge. So I'm going to discuss more about this bridge in part 2 of the video series, where I'm going to really look into what this bridge is.
Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell notification icon so as to not miss my next video.